Good morning, everyone. So today we are looking at a pattern that I call Tumbling Blocks Weave, and it's something that particularly when you look at the backlit form, you can see these meta blocks in the pattern where you have these rhombus panels, and there's 3 of them forming this kind of block shape, and you see that covering the entire pattern. And we're going to be folding this today on a 48 fold diagonal triangle grid on a hexagon. And if you're not familiar with that grid, check out last week's live stream where I used this piece of paper specifically, which is why it has drawings on it to show you how to fold that grid. And for today's purposes, we're going to be talking about this pattern in terms of broader generalities. So we're going to be talking about the tiling used in the pattern. This is a structure that tells me, okay, I have this great big hexagon, and that's connecting to the big edges of a trapezoid. The pleats that come out of these trapezoids, where they cross, they form a rhombus. Then in order to, and you're going to see the same thing on opposite sides of this rhombus. So that's a position of 2-fold rotational symmetry in the broader pattern. And then you're going to have these triangles on the middle of the 3 smaller edges, the 3 single depth pleats of the trapezoid twists. So these are the rules that I'm getting in my head before I start folding. We have hexagon going into trapezoid, going into rhombus on 2 sides of the trapezoid, and triangle on that middle single depth pleat. And one of the cool things about this structure is that the lines at the edges of the shapes go all the way through, which means that as we fold, we can add the hexagon, and then we can add a layer of twists around that hexagon and not have any plate overlaps when we're done. And then, excuse me, I'll show you how the next layer, we don't have to go all the way out through the next hexagon. We can split those hexagons through the middle and still get a nice pattern, or still get a nice stopping point, and then continue on out. So we're not doing all 1, 2, 3, 4 layers at the same time. And then the layer after that is that single layer. That's probably about how far we'll get on this 48 division grid. The pattern I showed at the beginning was folded with 96 grid divisions on a diagonal grid. So it would be another division of 2 after 48, but I recommend starting with bigger paper. So let's go ahead and get started. This pattern starts with a closed hexagon twist, and it's a double depth closed hexagon twist. So conveniently, I have all of the lines drawn on here that will be my mountain fold lines. And this is going to be a right-handed twist, so my valley is going to be above the mountain on the right-hand side. If you do not have these lines on your paper, then you want to find the center of your grid by folding over in 2 different directions, making sure that these corners are all matching up. And that is how you'll find the center. You can choose to mark the point or mark the lines, however you want to do things. So this double depth closed hexagon, the mountain and valley are 2 spaces apart. I need that same pleat on all 6 sides. And notice how I'm using the table to keep my previous pleats that I set up in place. Oftentimes when people have trouble folding hexagon twists, it's because they're lifting the paper off the table, and so they don't have enough hands to keep everything in place at the same time. But if you're using your table as extra hands, that problem goes away. So it's worth double checking that your initial folds are still having the mountain and valley spaced 2 spaces apart at this point. And I'll zoom in a bit to show how this is going to become flat. And this process is very similar to the single depth closed hexagon twist. We want to bring it in as much as we can and then grab it and give it a sharp twist. The double depth hexagons generally go down, at least the closed ones go down a bit easier than their single depth counterparts. All of the twists for this pattern are going to be on the same side of the paper. So we'll just be staying here throughout. And one other regularity of this pattern in particular is that all of the parallel pairs of valley folds, let me grab my pens, are going to be 2 spaces apart. So we've got a valley fold in here. The next valley fold is going to be 2 grid spaces away, which, since this was a double depth pleat, is going to sit right at that folded mountain. What I'm going to do to make this easier to fold, easier to manipulate the paper, is fold over this double depth pleat of the hexagon to give me space to put in the trapezoid. We're going to be doing an open trapezoid twist. So I have my valley fold determined by the tube pleat spacing. And then all my other 3 pleats of this trapezoid are going to be single wide pleats. Or the pleat depth of these 3 other pleats is going to be 1, is another way to say that. So when folding an open trapezoid twist, we have our mountain fold coming from the double depth plate, and then we encounter the mountain fold going in the first single wide direction. Then that same grid line of mountain that was the mountain in the double depth plate becomes a mountain of the middle single depth plate. And then 1 space further out than the intersection of the initial 2 mountains is the intersection of the final 2 mountains. And you might notice that this twist may want to buckle and fold in. You just need to make sure that the valley of the double depth plate is continuing straight all the way until it hits this 3rd single depth plate. With that in place, we'll press to squash. From here, we want to get our next trapezoid twist in place, and we want to be able to set up our rhombus that we saw earlier in the video when I was showing the tiling is going to resolve the pleats from the 2 trapezoid twists. So if I want to avoid ever folding through existing twists, then I would work around clockwise, adding these trapezoids, but that's going to make it slightly harder to set up the rhombus twists. It's not going to be a huge deal. Or I can turn back the other way, and if I'm folding through this trapezoid twist, you'll notice that the grid lines below and the grid lines inside the trapezoid are lined up. So I'm not adding any new creases if I bend this layer back a bit to help me set up the new twist. And again, we have those two spaces between parallel valley folds. And we're going to have a pleat overlap down here as we set up our first single depth pleat of the trapezoid. Our second single depth pleat has the same mountain fold as the double depth pleat. And our third intersects that mountain that runs all the way through, one space further out than the intersection of the first single depth pleat. And you can see it's making these two grid triangles stand out like a puffy open hexagon star. And that's because the open trapezoid is precisely half of the open hexagon. Now I want to go ahead and resolve this pleat overlap, and we're going to use an open rhombus twist. So the first thing we need to figure out is which direction is moving over two spaces and which direction is moving over only one space. And conveniently, since we know that in this pattern, there are always two spaces between parallel valley folds. I've got a valley fold in here. I'm going to need another valley fold 2 spaces away. And this one will be the usual version of tube pleat spacing where there's single depth pleats on either side of that, so they meet in the middle. And I can notice that that is 2 spaces away. These two mountain folds are 2 spaces away from each other. So then the other direction, mountain folds need to be 1 space away. So with a open rhombus twist, you're looking for 2 and 1. With a closed rhombus twist, you're looking for 1 and 0. So that's what we're looking for in this open rhombus twist, which resolves the pleat overlaps. And we can move on and repeat those 2 twists again as we go around the center. So putting in my new open trapezoid twist, and if you would like a slower copy of these instructions, they are earlier in the video. Ooh, and I just realized I took my eye off of the comments, but there's nothing there yet. I'm happy to answer questions as I go, so feel free to write stuff in that comment section. One of the things I haven't mentioned yet that I believe I put in the title or the description for this video is that this tiling, this structure, is one that will show up in Advent of Tess this year. So that is definitely something to get excited about. I've finalized the lineup of patterns for Advent of Tess. It is going to feature a lot of trapezoid twists this year, and there's going to be some pretty challenging patterns. So it's time to start getting excited for December. And I know that a lot of people, once they finish the smaller patterns for Advent of Tess, like to fold more repeats of each pattern. So that's why I'm doing this video now in July instead of waiting until, I don't know, next January or something, because I want you to be able to fold as many repeats of any of the patterns in Advent of Tess as soon as you come across them. So you'll notice I'm working my way around doing those same 2 twists that I was before, the open trapezoid and then the open rhombus. The other marker for the open rhombus that I like to look for is this anvil shape. So I've got this little flat on the top, flat on the bottom, notched on the sides shape that then squashes out into the open rhombus twist. And once more, I'll add in open trapezoid. And this time we have an additional pleat overlap between this trapezoid and my first trapezoid to, well, that's an indicator that we've gotten all the way around. And we're going to have a bonus rhombus out here. So this pleat overlap is a little bit more trapped than the overlaps we've been working with. And that was why I chose to work in the direction around the center that we did, so that the rhombus twists would be easier to find from the overlap. But we can still, as long as we make sure we're opening all the way, still find that new rhombus twist and press to squash. So from here, one of the cool things is that the edge of the paper is still perfectly hexagonal. If we zoom out, we still have a perfectly hexagonal boundary, which is why I'm using the diagonal grid for this pattern, because there's just so many, well, there's such a nice alignment between the repeats of this pattern and this grid that gets you the perfect hexagonal boundary. So zooming back in, the next thing that we'll want to do is use our information about this pattern. Like I've said, we have tube pleats everywhere, 2 spaces between parallel valley folds. Let's take that one as an example. And we have one shape that I pointed out at the beginning that we do not have represented yet on here. We have the hexagon, we have the trapezoid, we have the rhombus, we do not have the triangle. And that triangle is going to go on the remaining pleat of the trapezoid that isn't already going to another twist. And in this pattern, that is going to be an open triangle twist. So when I set up my tube pleat in here, I'm going to set up the triangle so that it's outlining one grid triangle in the center, and then we'll squash to find the final triangle. So now I have 2 pleat overlaps, one on either side, and I'm going to go ahead and deal with this one that's a little harder to open first, just to get it out of the way. So that ordering of putting in the triangle first isn't necessarily like some optimal ordering for folding the pattern. It's more about, oh, if I'm looking at a crease pattern and trying to fold this, what are the identifiable features that I can add in that will tell me what everything else has to do. So the identifiable features here is on the middle single depth pleat of the trapezoid, I have a open triangle twist at 2 pleat spacing. And by symmetry, because that's a position of threefold rotational symmetry in the pattern, all of the other pleats coming out of that triangle are going to be middle single depth pleats of trapezoids. And so I can say, okay, I have one single depth pleat. This has to be, from the triangle, has to be the middle single depth pleat. So my third goes over here. And then I have my double depth pleat heading out to the edge. And squash. And over here, this is likewise the middle single depth pleat of a trapezoid. And so if this one's the middle, this one's on this side, this one needs to be on the opposite side. And notice that I have a pleat from my latest trapezoid coming through this area. I'm going to open it up and put in a 3-way intersection of mountain folds with this new pleat that's coming over. So that gives me the space to lay down my new trapezoid twist. And what we can say is, if I have pleats coming from 2 trapezoid twists, that is going to create a rhombus. But remember, when I had the tiling up, this step of the pattern, we're not going all the way through, we're not going all the way through that next hexagon. And so we need a cutoff point where we say, okay, we're stopping here and we'll pick it up on the next string around. And that cutoff point goes through the center of the next hexagons and the middle of these next rhombi. So these 2 pleats coming in, I'm finding a flat foldable solution. I'm going to leave it like that for now. Then rotating around, I'm not going to start with the triangle twist, even though that's how I started the previous set of parallel pleats. Since I'm working around this way, I'm going to just continue working around, and I'm going to use the copy of this guy that's here in the center as a way of finding my spacing for the next twists that need to go in. So you can see this trapezoid and rhombus is in exactly the same orientation as this trapezoid and rhombus. In this pattern, there is only one trapezoid position, only one rhombus position, and then the symmetry makes the copies of them. And so I can trust that these are the same situations, and therefore I'm going to have 2 spaces from the valley fold under here. 1, 2, to a double depth pleat going into a trapezoid twist. And what I'm doing is I'm putting in a double depth pleat overlap down below, because it's going to be easier to deal with this trapezoid and get it squashed if I'm not worrying about what the hexagon intersection is doing. And then the mountain fold of that double depth pleat is going to continue as the mountain of the single depth pleat. I'm taking that next pleat that I would have crossed and putting in a 3-way intersection of mountain folds, and then finding, because the mountain of the double depth that goes through to the single depth, that's the middle single depth pleat, I need my 3rd single depth pleat. Zoom in a little bit. So that's going to send another crease out this way and squash. From here, I can say, oh, this double depth intersection, I'm going to open that up and find this I-beam structure where I have two spaces between the intersections. And I'm going to take that and lay it down flat. So I've got this zigzag going on where the valley fold is coming all the way to the corner of the trapezoid twist. And that goes for this side as well. It's, if you've watched a lot of my videos before, it's the 2-pleat version of the half hexagon tube, which has 3 pleats going into it. So then I'm coming around to that 3-way intersection on the middle single depth pleat of these trapezoids. So that's going to be my open triangle twist. And then we already saw this intersection between the pleat from the triangle and the pleat from the next rhombus. Those are coming together to make a trapezoid twist where the middle single depth pleat is coming from the triangle. And as we feed our third single depth pleat back, that is going to create a 3-way intersection. Excuse me. Another way of identifying this third single depth pleat, instead of saying, oh, that's the layout for an open trapezoid, is to say, okay, I need my valley fold 2 spaces from the valley fold of this pleat going into the triangle. So tube pleat spacing, as I said before, is everywhere in this pattern. And then we can squash the trapezoid. And now we have the same moves on the next edge. So I have the 2 spaces between valley folds. That's a single depth pleat. So it's 2 spaces out to where I drew that line. And this new pleat is going to be a double depth pleat. And I can use that double depth pleat to find the middle single depth pleat of the new trapezoid, feeding past that trapezoid to set up a 3-way intersection, which if it was done from the other side of the paper, I would call it a triangle wrap. And find my third single depth pleat, leaving the double depth pleats overlapping instead of immediately forming this hexagon platform is going to give me the space to squash the trapezoid twist without having to remove stuff from on top of it. And then we can come back and create the hexagon platform. And I just saw earlier in the chat, welcome. And then we can turn the 3-way intersection into an open triangle twist. And open up the pleat overlap to put in the second trapezoid for this edge. Welcome, Guillaume. Hello, hello. Hopefully I'm pronouncing your name correctly. So one thing that I want to look at real quick is the tiling again. And let's see if I can get that set up quickly. So in the tiling, the part that we're doing right now, we already have this central chunk, and on each edge we're adding in another pleat to the double depth hexagon. We're adding one trapezoid, one triangle, second trapezoid, setting up half of the rhombus, and that feeds one pleat into the next double depth hexagon. So that on the next edge, we're adding our two trapezoids, a triangle, and half a rhombus, and we're continuing around and around. Then the next layer, we'll finish our hexagons and finish the rhombi and add two trapezoids and a triangle. And that's how we'll make our way around. And then after that, we'll have, I think it's actually alternating rhombus and trapezoid twists. So once you see the tiling view of these patterns, figuring out what parts of it to fold next is actually rather straightforward. So that's what's going on in this pattern. I'm going to continue folding, but I'll work a little bit faster so we can get into that next ring around the center. And as usual, if you have any questions or comments, I am keeping an eye on the chat, so make sure to ask away. So with this particular pattern, I'm really keying in on tube pleat spacing for a lot of these placement decisions. Like, I don't have pleat overlaps. I need to decide where to put the next pleat. Then I'm like, oh, 2 spaces between the valley folds. And that's how I decide where to put the next pleat. And then it's a matter of remembering, okay, for this particular pattern, I'm using open trapezoid, open rhombus, open triangle, closed hexagon. And for a pattern that uses trapezoid twists, there is quite a bit more simplicity than most. Oh, that's awesome, Kieran, that you're going to make this pattern for your neighbor's birthday. I love hearing about people giving origami as gifts. And yeah, I will say, even though like this is relatively simple for a pattern that uses trapezoid twists, it still does use trapezoid twists and open rhombus twists. So I definitely wouldn't call it a beginner level pattern, but it is a pretty good introduction to trapezoid twists if you already have an understanding of the hexagon, triangle, and rhombus. And it's just fun to see all these different applications of the trapezoid twists. Like, we can get into some pretty complex stuff. And actually, I want to flag here that I'm getting into the pleat overlaps from the first edge. So I'm going to set up this open triangle twist. And I really kind of got lucky here that this pleat didn't go through the trapezoid. And then when I'm setting up my next trapezoid, I'm going to open up the overlap from the double depth pleat from the first edge. And get that in place, and I can wiggle things around to give myself a nice flat squashing surface. And then put it back to match the rest of the pattern. So even now, we've done more of the pattern and we still have a perfect hexagon outline. So zooming back in, like I mentioned earlier with the tiling, we want to finish these hexagons, finish the rhombus twists, add 2 trapezoids and a triangle, and that will complete our loop on these edges. And what I'm going to do is, for my first hexagon, I'm going to move it from 2 pleats coming in to 3. So I'm going to find my third double depth pleat in this direction, create a half hexagon tube. And I'm doing this hexagon in stages instead of jumping to finish it all, because I'm avoiding having a pleat cross through these other 2 pleats that are on this edge. So I'm making my 6th edge easier by just adding in the 1 pleat that I need right now for the first edge. So then I'm going to have an open trapezoid twist on this pleat, but I also have that 3-way intersection that was left behind further in. And so what I'm going to do is open up that 3-way intersection to find the pleats of the rhombus twist, and have that already set up. And I have some choices of how to proceed from here. I could go ahead and set up that trapezoid twist, or I could use this 3-way intersection of mountain folds on top and bring up another pleat coming down into the middle, and use that and tuck under and give myself space to squash the rhombus twist first. And then I can lift these layers back on top, pop out that point that was sunken under. Here we have the mountain of our through line of the trapezoid, and we need our third direction of single depth pleat. And I can take this flap over to the side to squash my open trapezoid twist. From here, we have overlaps between this rhombus and the double depth hexagon. And I'm going to open that up and do a similar tactic where I'm going to run a third pleat into that hexagon, turn it into a half hexagon tube, and then use the mountain fold coming out for that third pleat of the hexagon to set up my new trapezoid twist. And then I can move layers out of the way to squash the trapezoid. And lay the hexagon back down. And I have this three-way intersection that I kind of quietly set up without saying anything that I can turn into the open triangle twist. Okay, so now moving around, this hexagon is already a half hexagon tube. If I add another pleat, it becomes 4 pleats coming into the hexagon and creating another overlap down here. So I may as well get the 5th and 6th pleats of this hexagon. Basically, when you're folding in new tilings, when in doubt, delay folding all the pleats of the hexagon as long as possible. That's my advice. And so I can make sure that that's rotated all the way around, and then peel back this layer as I start setting up the trapezoid. And I can use the pleat from the trapezoid to help me set up the rhombus. And like we saw in the previous round, the previous edge, I could lay the trapezoid flat and then fold the rhombus first and then come back and fold it. But I can also set them both up and then squash them both. And then lay the layers of the hexagon back on top. So continuing around, here I'm going to find the 3rd double depth pleat heading into this hexagon. And it won't want to lay super flat right away. If I have more flatness over here, it'll be more 3D over here and vice versa. But I can get that laying down and then find the remaining pleats of my trapezoid twist. And here I'm setting up a 3-way intersection of mountain folds. For my eventual triangle twist. So this one, we can just kind of scoop those layers out of the way, squash the trapezoid, put the layers back, and then move the pleat over to squash the open triangle twist. And so what I'm noticing is that we might maybe be able to fit a few more twists around here, but this is going to be the nicest edge that we have an option to have in this pattern. So I'm probably going to leave it with this edge, and that's with 48 divisions, with 96 divisions, like I showed on the pattern in the beginning. You can have 2 rings of repeats around the center with their trapezoids and rhombi, and still have a border to reach the edge. So next up here, I'm going to repeat these steps that I just did, starting with finishing the hexagon twist. Making sure that that's, I don't know if you saw it, it was back twisted. We want to make sure that that's twisted all the way around. And then I can fold some layers back to make room for the new trapezoid and rhombus. So these, there's a whole variety of patterns that can be folded with this structure, and you don't have to put all the twists on the same side, which means that you can get more pattern with less grid. And I'm actually going to be folding one of those patterns with all the trapezoid twists on one side and everything else on the other side next week in my live stream as a demonstration instead of a tutorial. So that's going to be a fun one. And you can use these same sequences, except with many more wraps along the way, to fold those patterns where you have the twists on opposite sides. The other super cool thing about this structure is that you can choose to move all of the twists closer together or further apart. So if you wanted to do the pattern that I'm doing next week, you could choose to do it with everything spaced one spacing further apart, and that would be an easier option. So the reason why you're able to space everything further apart on this pattern, where that's, or on this tiling really, because it's a tiling level phenomenon, is exactly the same reason that we're able to have stopping points without pleat overlaps in this folding sequence. So since the lines between the shapes in the tiling continue straight all the way through, and there's a straight line that goes all the way through between any 2 pairs of shapes, you can freely add space between all the shapes if you want. And so I've now transitioned to moving a bit faster and not clearly saying everything that I'm doing, because we have exact copies of these same steps earlier in the video. So as I'm working my way through a set of parallel pleats, I'm finishing the hexagon, then adding in the first trapezoid and finishing the rhombus, then adding in the second trapezoid, which adds a third pleat to our existing hexagon setup. And sets up the conditions for the triangle. And so then I have my second trapezoid and my triangle, and then it's back to finishing a hexagon. So I know I'm making all of these moves look easy. It's not as easy as it looks, but that's part of the fun of it, that these patterns are a challenge, and you can always find new patterns to challenge yourself with. That's part of the fun of Advent of Tess too, that you get not only the tutorials for the particular patterns, but you get exposed to different ways of folding origami tessellations, and you get ideas about how other patterns could work. Like I was mentioning earlier, that you could take this pattern and do everything a space further apart, and then the trapezoids wouldn't be overlapping with the hexagons. And you can get some of the, you could do a different pattern where you start with the same hexagon, but then you do the trapezoids on the opposite side. And one of the things about these patterns that's, I don't know about restrictive, but once you pick 3 of the twists, so let's say and really it's the hexagon, the rhombus, and the triangle that all need to really work together for the symmetry points. So once you pick the hexagon, the trapezoid, and the rhombus, then the triangle is determined. If you pick the hexagon, trapezoid, and triangle, then the rhombus is determined. And these are symmetry conditions for the pattern as a whole. So it's not that any hexagon, trapezoid, and rhombus and triangle combination would work. It's just that there's a lot more options than I've shown today. And actually, speaking of options, this is the one that I'll be folding with more repeats next week. It's a really fun little pattern. It'll be one of the ones that I teach in Advent of Tess this year. And yeah, that'll be a good time. So opening up, I'm on to my final edge of this ring of repeats. Setting up the rhombus twist and the trapezoid twist. Oh, and one thing that just occurred to me, this is actually an an example of a category of patterns that are particularly nice to give as gifts, because even if your skill level isn't super high, the side that we're working on is actually the side, if you frame it, that you can make sure that no one sees. So if your twist squashing skills are less precise than you want, then doing patterns with all the twists on one side can make it so that you just show the other side, which is mysteriously weave looking, and no one can ever see what you think are the imperfections. And speaking of that woven other side, it's time for the big reveal. Oh, that's nice. We get this kind of meta box with all of our little boxes. So that's a particularly nice result for 48 grid divisions. And let me get my light so I can show the backlighting. You do this with the light, you get some really cool effects too. So that is Tumbling Blocks Weave. This is a tiling that will show up, I can say specifically the last 3 days of Advent of Tess. There's a lot of variety that you can make with the tiling, not just this pattern itself. We saw one example of that already, which I will be folding a bigger version of next week here in my live stream. And yeah, thanks everyone for coming and watching, and I hope you go and fold this for yourself. And again, the diagonal grid on a hexagon is what I taught in last week's live stream, and the link is in the description. So happy folding everyone, and see you